Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. Carroll A. Deering. In January of 1921, a magnificent five-masted sailing schooner called the Carroll A. Deering ran hard aground on a notorious stretch of underwater sandbar off the coast of North Carolina called Diamond Shoals. The ship was found in generally good condition, her white canvas sails still set in full, her running gear intact, her galley stove warm. There was food being prepared for the following day's meal: spare ribs, pea soup, coffee. Red distress signals burned at the masthead. 11 men had vanished. Not a single soul was found. Not a body, not a note, not a witness. The ship's log, the navigational instruments, the lifeboats, and every personal possession belonging to every member of the crew had disappeared, and the steering gear had been smashed apart, not by a wave, but deliberately by a human hand. 5 departments of the United States government would investigate. The FBI would get involved. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce and future President of the United States, would personally oversee an inquiry that would span more than a year. None of it would produce a satisfying answer. The Carroll A. Deering remains, more than a century later, one of the most endearing and genuinely puzzling maritime mysteries in American history. The Carroll A. Deering is often mentioned alongside the Mary Celeste, the brigantine found drifting and crewless in the Atlantic in 1872. The comparison is instructive and in some ways misleading. The Mary Celeste was found in open water, far from any hazard, with no obvious reason for abandonment. The Carroll A. Deering was found hard aground on one of the most dangerous stretches of coastlines in the world, which provides a more obvious physical context for abandonment, even if it doesn't explain the details. The Mary Celeste's crew disappeared, leaving their personal belongings, but also leaving no specific evidence of internal conflict. The Carroll A. Deering's case carries the explicit witnessed threat from Barbados as a thread of pre-existing human drama. Both are genuine mysteries, but the Deering is, if anything, more specific, more loaded with clues that don't quite add up, more peopled with individual whose story we can trace, more situated in a historical moment we can understand. There is also something worth noting about the era in which this happened, and the era in which we are retelling it. January 1921 was a world without air travel, without satellite communication, without the kind of dense surveillance infrastructure that characterizes modern maritime space. A ship at sea in 1921 was genuinely at sea, beyond reach, beyond oversight, beyond help. The nearest radio station might be hundreds of miles away, and the Deering carried no radio equipment at all. What happened aboard that ship happened in a bubble of complete isolation, witnessed only by the sea and the men themselves. This is part of why the mystery endures. There were no external sensors, no black box, no satellite track. There is only what was found afterward, in the inference we can draw from the physical evidence of a ship that tells part of its own story and refuses to finish. This is the whole story. Part 1. The Last Age of Sail. To understand the Carroll A. Deering, we have to understand the world she was born into, and why, even in 1919, she was already a kind of ghost. Not a ghost ship yet, but a ghost of an era. A magnificent wooden sailing vessel, launched at the very moment such vessels were ceasing to make sense. For roughly 3 centuries, from the late 1500s through the early 1900s, wooden sailing ships were the dominant technology of global commerce. They carried spices and slaves, coal and cotton, immigrants and armies. The men who built them, sailed them, and owned them constituted one of the most powerful and interconnected industries in human history. The great shipbuilding towns of the American Northeast, Bath and Rockland and Camden in Maine, New Bedford and Fall River in Massachusetts, and dozens of smaller port cities scattered between them, were centers of craft, wealth, and maritime culture that shaped entire regions. Bath, Maine, in particular, holds a special place in this story. Sitting on the western bank of the Kennebec River, where fresh water meets tidal salt water, Bath had been building wooden ships since the 1740s. By the middle of the 19th century, it was the 5th largest port in the United States by tonnage. At the peak of the wooden shipbuilding era, around 1854, 22 separate shipyards operated along the Bath shoreline. The families who ran them, the Pattons, the Sewells, the McLelands, built vast fortunes and constructed elaborate Victorian mansions that still line the streets of the city today, monuments to the wealth that wind and wood once created. What Bath specialized in more than anywhere else on Earth was the large multi-masted schooners. While the British were building steel-hulled steamships and the clipper ship era was giving way to engines and propellers, the wooden shipbuilders of Maine held on, innovating within the constraints of their traditional materials by building bigger and bigger sailing vessels. The logic was sound, at least for a time. If your ship was large enough, the economics of wind power remained competitive with steam. You don't pay for coal, you don't need expensive engine maintenance, you just need canvas, rope, and a skilled crew. The result was a series of increasingly improbable and magnificent vessels, 4-masted schooners, then 5-masted, then 6-masted, that represented the absolute apex of wooden shipbuilding technology. The first 4-masted schooner on the East Coast was built in Bath in 1880. In 1900, the George W. Wells, built in Camden, Maine, became the first 6-masted schooner ever constructed on the East Coast. In 1909, the Wyoming, built at Bath's Percy and Small Shipyard, became the largest wooden sailing vessel ever built in the United States, stretching 450 feet from bow to stern, longer than a football field. She required a crew of only 14 men to operate, an extraordinary ratio for a vessel of her size, achieved through the mechanical advantage of multiple masts and fore and aft rigging. The Wyoming was, in retrospect, the high watermark of an era. She was also, as it happened, a harbinger of its end. By the time she was launched, The First World War was only 5 years away. The war would transform global shipping, accelerating the adoption of steel-hulled steamships and leaving wooden sailing vessels increasingly marginal. The coal trade, which had been the economic backbone of the big schooner industry, transporting coal from the mines of Virginia and Pennsylvania to the homes and factories of the Northeast and beyond, was being encroached on by the expanding network of railroads and the growing fleet of motorized freighters. After the First World War ended in 1918, Bath's shipyards fell quiet. One by one they closed. The Deering family's yard, the Gardner G. Deering shipyard, sat on the bank of the Kennebec River at what is now the site of the Maine Maritime Museum. The Deerings had built a respectable fleet of schooners over the years, solid working vessels designed for the coal trade. In 1919, they launched their last ship. It was also symbolically one of the last wooden commercial schooners ever built in the United States. They named it after the owner's youngest son, Carroll A. Deering. Carroll A. Deering, the man, was at the time a bookkeeper for the company. He lived a long life, dying in 1967 at the age of 84, and he reportedly never much enjoyed the notoriety that came from sharing his name with a ghost ship. But on April 4th, 1919, when the Carroll A. Deering slid down the way of the Kennebec River and into the water for the first time, she was an object of genuine beauty. She was 255 feet long and 44 feet wide. She weighed 1,879 gross tons and could carry approximately 3,500 tons of cargo. 5 masts towered above her deck. Oregon pine masts, each one 108 feet tall, with top masts of additional 46 feet above them. The interior was finished in oak, mahogany, and ash. She had a working bathroom with open plumbing. Her cabins were lit by electricity and heated by steam. She was, by any measure, a superb ship. What makes the Carroll A. Deering's construction particularly notable, in retrospect, is that she was the last ship ever built by the G.G. Deering Company. The company had built roughly 100 vessels over its history. The Carroll A. Deering was the 100th and final one, a grand, beautiful full stop at the end of a long sentence, along with the last schooners completed by 2 neighboring Bath shipyards, Percy and Small and Pendleton Brothers. The Carroll A. Deering marked the effective end of nearly 3 centuries of wooden shipbuilding on the Kennebec River. When she launched, the era that had built her was already over. The shipyard that launched her were already closing. The men who built her were already finding other work. She was, from the moment she touched the water, the last of something. The world of 1919 was no longer the world of wooden schooners. Steam and steel had won. The Carroll A. Deering was launched into a maritime economy that was already beginning to forget how to value the things she represented. She spent the first year of her life making runs along the eastern seaboard, carrying coal and other bulk cargo, doing the mundane work she had been built for. She was good at it. And then, in the summer of 1920, she was assigned what would prove to be her final voyage. Part 2. The Ship and Her Captains. The Carroll A. Deering was designed to carry a cargo of coal from Newport News, Virginia, one of the great coal shipping ports of the East Coast, where the rail lines from the Appalachian coalfield met the sea, south to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and then return home. It was a long voyage, roughly 5,000 nautical miles each way, but not an unusual one for a vessel of her class. The coal trade between the American East Coast and Brazil was well established by 1920, and the route was familiar to experienced sailors. To understand what such voyage meant in practical terms, it helps to think about life aboard a five-masted commercial schooner in the early 1920s. The Carroll A Deering carried a complement of 11 men: the captain, the first mate, the second mate if one was assigned on, an engineer responsible for the ship's auxiliary motor and pumps, a cook, and the remainder common sailors. The ship was luxurious by working vessel standards: oak and mahogany interiors, electric lighting, steam heat, a real bathroom, but she was still a working vessel, and life aboard her was defined by the rhythms of watches, maintenance, sail management, and the relentless physical labor of keeping a 255-foot wooden ship functioning at sea. A voyage from Virginia to Brazil and back, by the route the Deering would take, was roughly 4 to 6 months in total. The outward journey took the ship south along the American coast, past the Florida Keys, through the Caribbean, and then across the equatorial Atlantic to the bulge of South America, and down to Rio de Janeiro. The return voyage reversed the track, and with no cargo aboard, sailing in ballast, the ship would have moved somewhat faster, riding higher in the water. All told, the crew would have been living together in close quarters for the better part of half a year. On a sailing vessel in 1920, there was no radio to speak of. The Deering carried no wireless equipment, which would become significant later. No way to easily contact home, no real privacy, and no way off the ship except to wait until it reached a port. Sailors understood this. It was simply the nature of the life. But it also meant that whatever tensions existed among the crew, between men, between officers, between captain and crew, those tensions had nowhere to go. They accumulated over weeks and months at sea, compressed into the small space of a ship, and sometimes they didn't stay compressed. The first captain assigned to the voyage was William H. Merritt. His life story illuminates the kind of men who commanded these ships in the final years of the sailing era. Merritt was a veteran of the sea who had commanded several vessels for the Deering Company. He was also a decorated hero of the First World War. In August of 1918, while in command of the five-masted schooner Dorothy B. Barrett, another Deering-built vessel, his ship was torpedoed by the German submarine U-117 off Cape May, New Jersey. Merritt managed to save his entire crew, a feat for which he was formally cited for bravery under fire. He was, in other words, a man who had already proven himself in extremity, and his son, Sewell Merritt, was signed on as first mate for the Rio voyage, a common arrangement in the merchant marine of the era. Families sailing together, sons learning the trade from their fathers. The Carroll A Deering departed Puerto Rico on July 19th, 1920, made a stop at Newport News to take on the coal cargo, and set out for Brazil on August 26, 1920. She cleared the Virginia Capes in good order, but within days, Captain Merritt fell seriously ill. The nature of the illness is not precisely recorded, but it was severe enough to be immediately incapacitating. The ship turned back. She put into the port of Lewis, Delaware, where both Merritt and his son disembarked. The son naturally chose to stay with his ailing father. This seemingly minor disruption, a sick captain, delayed departure, set off a chain of substitutions that would define everything that followed. The daring company, needing to salvage the voyage, turned to a 66-year-old retired sea captain named Willis B. Wormel. Wormel was a large man. Accounts describe him as weighing around 200 pounds, with decades of experience on the water. He had sailed coastal routes and deep water routes, had commanded multiple vessels, and was known as a capable, if somewhat past his prime mariner. He was also, critically, a man whose eyesight was failing. This detail would become significant. With Wormel signed on as captain, the company needed a first mate to replace Sewell Merritt. They hired a man named Charles B. McClellan, and here, quietly, is where the trouble began. The Carroll A. Deering set sail again from Newport News on September 8, 1920, and arrived in Rio de Janeiro without significant incident, delivering her cargo of coal on schedule. But by the time she arrived, it was already clear that something was wrong between the new captain and his new first mate. In Rio, Wormel was given a few days while the cargo was unloaded, and the ship was prepared for the journey home. He spent his time with an old friend, a fellow captain named Goodwin, whose vessel happened to be docked in the same port. The two men met and talked, as old friends do, swapping stories, catching up on the state of the industry, the state of their respective ships and crew. And according to Captain Goodwin's later account to investigators, Wormel was troubled. He spoke of his crew with open disdain. He didn't trust them. He found them difficult to manage. The one exception, Wormel said, was the ship's engineer, a man named Herbert Bates, whom Goodwin also knew and thought well of. But for the rest of the crew, mostly Scandinavian sailors, primarily Danish, Wormel had little positive to say. And for McClellan, his first mate, he seemed to have something approaching genuine contempt. For his part, McClellan was forming his own grievances. The Carroll A. Deering left Rio on December 2, 1920, and made a stop in Barbados to take on supplies before heading north toward Hampton Roads, Virginia. It was in Barbados, in the port of Bridgetown, that matters came to a head. McClellan went into town and found his way to a bar called the Continental Cafe, where he proceeded to drink heavily. In the course of his drinking, he encountered Captain Hugh Norton, who commanded a vessel called the Augustus W. Snow. The two men talked, and McClellan, loosened by alcohol, apparently consumed by frustration, began to vent. He complained, volubly and specifically, that he could not effectively discipline the crew because Wormel kept overriding him. He said that Wormel's eyesight was so poor that McClellan was forced to handle all the navigation himself. He felt undercut and undermined and disrespected. He was, in short, a man who believed that he was doing the actual work of running the ship, while the captain, in his estimation, contributed little and interfered often. And then, and this is a detail that the investigators were returned to again and again, Captain Norton heard McClellan say something that went far beyond professional complaint. Sitting in the Continental Cafe with Norton and another captain, McClellan declared, "I'll get the captain before we get to Norfolk. I will." The statement was witnessed. It was specific. It was alarming. And it was not made in a single private moment of frustration. It was made in a public bar to other ship captains in a loud enough voice to be clearly heard. This was not someone thinking dark thoughts in private. This was a man broadcasting his intention to a room. Captain Norton, who heard this, later provided testimony to investigators about what he witnessed. His account and the accounts of other witnesses present that night in the Continental Cafe formed part of the evidentiary record that investigators repeatedly returned to throughout the 1921 inquiry. Norton was clear. McLaughlin had made an unmistakable threat. The words were, "Get the captain," and though the precise meaning of that threat remained ambiguous, it could have meant anything from a physical assault to some form of professional humiliation. The context of a drunken, rage-filled first mate ranting about his inability to manage his captain's interference made the darker interpretation difficult to entirely dismiss. McLaughlin was subsequently arrested, apparently for his drunken behavior in general, creating a public disturbance. He was put in jail, and then remarkably, Captain Wormel himself went to the jail and bailed McLaughlin out. He apparently forgave the man. On January 9, 1921, Wormel paid McLaughlin's fine, collected him from custody, and the Carroll A. Deering set sail northward toward home. Whether this was an act of generosity, of naivete, or of something more complex, a calculation perhaps that keeping McLaughlin was less disruptive than the alternative of trying to replace a first mate in a foreign port, we cannot know. What we know is that the two men sailed together in close quarters on a long ocean voyage, in a relationship that had been openly poisoned by contempt on both sides, and that at least one credible witness had heard the first mate threaten to get the captain before they reached their destination. The Carroll A. Deering was heading home, and something was wrong aboard her. What we do not know and what we cannot know is exactly when things went wrong. We know the last date Wormel kept the log in his own hand. We know the date the ship passed Cape Lookout. We can infer the likely time of grounding from when she was spotted on the morning of January 31st. But between those data points, between the sunny docks of Barbados and the gray January surf breaking over Diamond Shoal, there is a stretch of open ocean, an open time, in which 11 men were alone together on a ship with no radio and no witnesses. And whatever happened between them happened entirely in private. The sea was their only witness. Part 3. The Graveyard of the Atlantic. Before we follow the Deering into her final days, we need to understand the geography of what happened. Because the Carroll A. Deering didn't just disappear in open water, she ran aground on one of the most historically dangerous stretches of coastline in the Western Hemisphere, a place that had been sending ships to their graves for centuries, a place with an earned and terrible nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The North Carolina Outer Banks are a chain of long, narrow barrier islands that jut out into the Atlantic Ocean like a crooked finger, extending further east than any other part of the eastern seaboard. They barely protrude above water surface. In some places, the islands are less than half a mile wide, and they are among the most dynamic and changeable landforms on the planet. Storms reshape them constantly. The shorelines migrate. Inlets open and close. The entire system is in perpetual slow-motion flux. And at the easternmost point of this chain, where the islands curve south toward Cape Lookout, sits Cape Hatteras. Cape Hatteras is remarkable for several reasons, but the most significant for our purposes is what happens in the water directly in front of it. Two of the most powerful ocean current systems in the North Atlantic converge there. The warm, northward flowing Gulf Stream, which carries tropical water up from the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, and the cold, southward flowing Labrador Current, which descends from the Arctic. Where these two massive rivers of water collide, the results are unpredictable. Rapid onset fog, sudden violent squalls, powerful and conflicting wave patterns, the sea conditions that can go from manageable to lethal within a matter of hours. For centuries, the shipping lanes of the eastern seaboard followed these currents because the current themselves offered navigational advantages. A ship heading north would ride the Gulf Stream gaining speed. A ship heading south would follow the Labrador Current for the same reason. Both routes passed through the waters off Cape Hatteras. This concentration of maritime traffic in an area of exceptional navigational danger was a recipe for disaster on a statistical scale, and the history bears this out. More than 5,000 ships have sunk in these waters since European record-keeping began in 1526. Some estimates place the number even higher. Extending 14 miles offshore from Cape Hatteras, submerged beneath the surface but shallow enough to be instantly fatal to any vessel with a significant draft, are the Diamond Shoals. The name is almost poetic. It suggests clarity, sparkle, something precious. But the shoals are nothing of the kind. They are three distinct submerged sandbar systems: Hatteras Shoals, Inner Diamond Shoals, and Outer Diamond Shoals. They are not fixed. They shift with every major storm, changing shape and depth in ways that make them impossible to reliably chart. The authoritative NOAA chart for the area includes a remarkable notation. Hydrography is not charted for Diamond Shoals due to the changeable nature of the area. Navigation in the area is extremely hazardous to all types of craft. Within the space of 100 yards, the water depth changes from 35 feet to 12 feet to effectively impassable. A ship can ground on Diamond Shoals in conditions where, according to every navigational chart available, she should be in perfectly safe water. Hundreds of ships have done exactly this across centuries. The graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras Village opened in 2002 and substantially renovated in 2024. Estimates that 600 shipwrecks are attributable to the Diamond Shoals area alone. Among the more famous casualties, Civil War blockade runners attempting to sneak into Cape Fear River under cover of darkness, the USS Monitor, the iconic ironclad of the Battle of Hampton Roads, which sank in a storm while being towed south on December 31st, 1862, and which was only rediscovered in 1973 in 230 feet of water, 16 miles offshore. Dozens of tankers and freighters sunk by German U-boats during both World Wars, during which the shoals created a strategic bottleneck that submarine commanders exploited mercilessly. The shoreline around Cape Hatteras was also historically home to wreckers, Outer Banks residents who made part of their living by salvaging the cargo and materials of wrecked ships. Some accounts suggest that certain wreckers occasionally did worse than simply wait for ships to run aground on their own. Stories circulated, mostly unverifiable, of false signal fires lit to lure ships off course, of deliberate misdirection. These tales belong to the folklore of the Outer Banks more than to verified history, but they are part of the atmosphere of the place. the sense that the sea and the land here have never fully separated themselves from the idea of human predation. It was into this geography, in the waning days of January 1921, that the Carroll A. Deering sailed. She was heading north, homeward bound, running light. She was sailing in ballast, meaning she carried no cargo, only enough ballast to keep her stable in the water. Without the weight of the coal in her hold, she rode higher in the water and was more responsive to the wind, faster, and somewhat less predictable. The weather along the North Carolina coast in late January 1921 was brutal. Sustained winds, rough seas, the kind of conditions that the old sailors called a dirty blow. To navigate this stretch of coastline safely, ships in 1921 relied on a system of lighthouses and lightships, the latter being anchored vessels, not moving ships stationed at fixed positions near major hazards to provide guidance, lighting, and radio communication. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse itself, the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States, sent its beam more than 20 miles out to sea from the point of Cape Hatteras, warning ships away from the shoals. The Diamond Shoals lightship was anchored directly above the most dangerous part of the shoals themselves, as close as an anchored vessel could safely be, serving as a floating beacon at the outer edge of a hazard. And the Cape Lookout lightship, stationed further south, provided an early warning point for ships rounding the lower end of the Outer Banks and beginning the northward passage toward Cape Hatteras. This system of lightships was, in 1921, the front line of maritime safety on the Outer Banks, the first point of contact between incoming vessels and any kind of official oversight. Lightship keepers were experienced mariners in their own right, required to log the passage of vessels, monitor conditions, and attempt to communicate with ships that appeared to be in distress or off course. They were, in effect, the eyes and ears of maritime safety authority along a stretch of coast where the sea was too dangerous for any other kind of regular contact. The Carroll A. Deering was heading home. She would never get there. Part 4. The Final Days. On January 29, 1921, the Carroll A. Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship. This is the last human interaction with the vessel before she ran aground, and it is one of the most examined episodes in the entire mystery. Lightships were anchored vessels, not ships that moved, but ships that stayed put, marking dangerous shoals and headlands, equipped with lights and fog signals, and by 1921, wireless radio equipment. The keeper of the Cape Lookout lightship was a man named Captain Jacobson. He was experienced and observant, and his account of what he saw on January 29th is detailed and, in retrospect, deeply strange. As the Deering passed, a man aboard the schooner hailed the lightship using a megaphone. He was, Jacobson would later recall, tall and thin with reddish hair. His accent was foreign. Jacobson thought Scandinavian. The message he conveyed was specific. The Carroll A. Deering had lost both of her anchors in a storm off Cape Fear, and would the lightship keeper please notify the ship's owners, the G.G. Deering Company, of this fact. The Deering did not stop to wait for any kind of response. She continued on her course. Jacobson registered two things that struck him as off. First, the man doing the hailing was clearly not an officer. His manner wasn't that of a man accustomed to command. He didn't look or carry himself like a first mate or a captain. He seemed, Jacobson later told investigators, more like a common sailor. Second, the crew of the Deering was behaving oddly. They were milling about the ship's quarterdeck, the raised deck at the stern of the ship, which was traditionally the domain of officers only, where helmsmen stood and captains walked, not where ordinary sailors were supposed to be spending their time. A crew wandering freely on the quarterdeck was a crew that was either unsupervised or that had effectively stopped recognizing the authority that kept them off the quarterdeck in the first place. Jacobson took note of all of this. But his radio was not working, a breakdown never properly explained, and he could not report any of it. The Carroll A Deering sailed on, heading northeast directly toward the Diamond Shoals. There is another element of Jacobson's account that received significant investigative attention. Not long after the Deering passed, another ship also passed the Cape Lookout lightship, a steamer, moving in the same general direction. Jacobson noticed that as this steamer passed, a canvas had been hung along its side in the area where a ship's name would normally be visible, effectively hiding its identity. Jacobson tried to hail the steamer with his fog signal, which could be heard at a distance of 5 miles. The steamer failed to respond. It simply continued on its way, name hidden, pretending, if ships can be said to be pretending, not to notice. Who was this steamer? The question would occupy investigators for months. Some believed it might have been the SS Hewitt, another vessel that disappeared in the same area at approximately the same time. Others thought it might have been a rum runner, a liquor smuggler, of which there were many in these waters during Prohibition, all with excellent reasons for not wanting to be identified. Nobody ever definitively identified it. The following day, January 30th, the Carroll A Deering was spotted by the crew of another vessel transiting the area, the SS Lake Elon, which saw her near the Diamond Shoals lightship. The Deering appeared to be sailing a peculiar course. The Lake Elon's crew could see no one on her deck. They assumed the Deering's crew would see the lighthouse and the lightship warning them of the shoals, and they continue on their way without attempting to hail her. It was, as it happened, the last sighting of the Carroll A Deering while she was still under sail. At 6:30 on the morning of January 31st, 1921, a surfman named C.P. Brady was on watch at the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard station, scanning the horizon with the station's telescope. Through the early morning haze, he saw something strange. A 5-masted schooner, her white sails full, sitting hard aground on the outer edge of Diamond Shoals. The ship was enormous, 255 feet of her, all 5 masts standing, sails billowing on the wind. She looked almost triumphant from a distance, sailing boldly forward. And yet she was completely stuck, run hard into the sand, going nowhere. Brady raised the alarm. The seas were so rough that no rescue vessel could get close. The waves breaking over Diamond Shoals were described by witnesses as being 2 or 3 stories high. The surfmen at the Cape Hatteras station, experienced coastal rescuers trained specifically for this kind of operation, tried to launch and were driven back. The cutter Seminole came down from Wilmington. The cutter Manning in the wrecking tug Rescue came up from Norfolk. Still, the sea wouldn't cooperate. For 4 days, January 31st, February 1st, February 2nd, February 3rd, the Carroll A Deering sat on the shoals in plain view from the shore, her 5 masts standing, her white sails full and ghostly in the winter light, and no one could reach her. Those 4 days must have been extraordinary to witness. From the shore at Cape Hatteras, through binoculars and telescopes, rescuers could see the ship clearly. She looked from a distance almost intact. There was no obvious damage to the hull or the rigging. The sails were properly set, as though the ship were still sailing, still going somewhere. There was no smoke from the galley that could indicate someone cooking. There was no movement on deck, no figures moving about, no one at the wheel, no one on the rigging. The ship was simply there, enormous and still, battered by the waves that were too rough to cross, and beyond the reach of anyone who might have answered the question of what had happened to her crew. This particular quality of the Deering mystery, the long, visible, inaccessible presence of the ship before she could be boarded, contributed enormously to the sense of dread and strangeness that attached to the case from the very beginning. She had been sitting there in plain sight for 4 days. Whatever had happened, and the sea kept anyone from getting close enough to find out what it was. During those 4 days, everyone watching the stricken vessel noticed something. There was no sign of life, no one on deck, no one signaling, no movement at all. Finally, on the morning of February 4th, 1921, the sea calmed enough for a boarding party to approach the ship. Captain James Carlson of the wrecking tug Rescue led the party aboard, and what he found, what his crew found, is the heart of the story. The Carroll A Deering had been completely abandoned. The steering gear was in ruins. The ship's wheel itself had been broken. The binnacle box, the housing that contained the ship's compass, had been smashed in. The rudder had been disengaged from its stock. The mechanical connection between the wheel and the blade in the water that actually steers the ship had been severed. This damage appeared deliberate, not the damage of a wave, not the consequence of running aground. This was damage done by human hands, with apparent intent to render the ship impossible to steer. A sledgehammer was found nearby. Let us be precise about what it means to smash a binnacle and disengage a rudder. The binnacle is a heavy, fixed housing for the compass, typically made of brass and mounted firmly to the deck. Breaking it in is not something that happens by accident, even in rough weather. It required sustained, deliberate force. The rudder stock, similarly, does not simply come loose. It is a major structural element of the ship, and its disengagement requires purposeful action. Someone aboard the Carroll A Deering had, at some point before she ran aground, taken a sledgehammer to the steering gear with the specific intention of making the ship uncontrollable. This is not a minor detail. It is the single most important physical fact on the ship, and no theory about what happened to the Deering can be considered complete if it doesn't account for it. The ship's log was gone. All navigational instruments, the chronometer, the sextant, the charts, were all missing. Every personal possession belonging to every member of the crew had vanished. Clothing, money, documents, keepsakes. Both lifeboats were gone. The 2 ships' anchors were missing, which aligned with the report from Cape Lookout that the ship had lost them in a storm. Though losing both anchors in a single storm, rather than just having them dragged and fouled, was unusual. In the galley, the stove was still warm. Food was on it, being prepared for the following day's meals, just as though the cook had stepped out for a moment. Spare ribs, pea soup, coffee. The scale of the meal suggested it was being prepared for the full crew. The food had apparently been there, cooling for days. In the captain's quarters, the investigators found disorder. Charts were scattered about. A spare berth in the cabin showed signs of being recently slept in. Someone, other than the captain, had been sleeping in the captain's room. 3 pairs of boots had been left behind. Most revealingly, on the ship's navigational chart, there was a record of the voyage's course tracked in the captain's own handwriting up until January 23, 1921. After that date, the handwriting changed. Someone else had been keeping the log. Someone with a distinctly different handwriting from Wormel's. The distress signal, 2 red lights burned at the highest point of the rigging, were still burning, though faintly, their fuel nearly exhausted. A ladder was hanging over the ship's side, the kind of ladder that sailors use to climb in and out of small boats alongside a large vessel. Somewhere aboard the ship, according to at least some accounts, and the detail is sufficiently consistent across multiple sources to be worth noting, even if the precise number varies by storyteller. Investigators found a small cat, or 3 cats, depending on the accounts. The cats, unlike the crew, had remained. The Carroll A Deering had been declared a hazard to navigation. On March 4, 1921, after salvage attempt proved impossible, the constant battering of the waves had driven water into her hull and opened her seams to such a degree that she was beyond saving. The vessel was destroyed by dynamite. A portion of her bow later drifted ashore on Ocracoke Island. Wooden timbers from her hull washed up on Hatteras Island, where local residents used them to build houses. The ship's bell and her capstan, the heavy drum used for hauling up anchor chains, eventually found their way to the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, where they were on display as of 2016. And the crew was never found. Not a single body, not a lifeboat, not a piece of wreckage that could be traced to them. 11 men simply ceased to exist. Part 5. The Investigation. The disappearance of the Carroll A. Deering's crew attracted immediate public attention, in part because the maritime press was quick to characterize it in dramatic terms. The Washington Herald on February 3, 1921, described the ship as appearing like a Flying Dutchman, an immediate invocation of the most famous ghost ship legend in seafaring lore, the tale of the spectral vessel condemned to sail forever, never reaching port. The comparison was irresistible, and the story spread rapidly through the newspaper networks of the day. The captain's family drove much of what followed. Mrs. Lula Wormel, the captain's wife, was not a woman inclined to accept mystery without a fight. Neither was the Wormel's daughter, also named Lula. Together, alongside Captain Merritt, the original captain who had been replaced before the voyage, and the family's pastor, Reverend Dr. Addison Lorimer, they traveled to Washington, D.C., and personally appealed to Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, to launch a formal federal investigation. This delegation arrived in May 1921, energized by a remarkable development earlier that April, which we will discuss shortly. Hoover was already curious. Several other vessels had disappeared in the same general area around the same time as the Deering, and the pattern, such as it was, intrigued him. He agreed to open an investigation and placed his trusted assistant Lawrence Ritchie in charge of coordinating the effort. Before we proceed through the investigation's findings, it is worth pausing on Herbert Hoover himself and what his involvement tells us about how seriously the federal government took this case. In 1921, Hoover was at the beginning of a decade-long run as one of the most influential figures in American government. He had organized food relief for Europe after World War I, earning enormous international admiration, and had been one of the most effective cabinet secretaries in American history, transforming the Department of Commerce into an active force in economic policy. He was already being mentioned as a presidential candidate. He was also, as his later career would demonstrate, a man with genuine intellectual passion for solving problems, for organizing information, for getting to the bottom of things. The fact that Hoover became personally interested in the Carroll A. Deering case and directed substantial federal resource toward investigating it tells us that from the government's perspective, this was not simply a maritime accident. The combination of a completely abandoned ship, a missing crew, smashed steering gear, several other vessels disappearing in the same area at the same time, and the political context of the Red Scare and Prohibition all contributed to an atmosphere in which the Deering case felt like it might be the visible tip of a much larger and more dangerous iceberg. What followed was one of the most extensive peacetime investigations in the history of the United States maritime establishment up to that point. 5 full departments of the federal government became involved: the Department of Commerce, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Justice, the Navy, and the State Department. The FBI dispatched an agent named Thompson to Dare County, North Carolina in July 1921. The State Department sent confidential circulars to American consular officers at seaports around the world, asking them to be alert for any sign of the missing crew. The Navy was involved because of the possibility of foreign hostile action. The Treasury was involved because of prohibition in the rum-running question. Ritchie's approach was methodical. He went back to basics. Could the vessel's movements between her last confirmed sighting at Cape Lookout on January 29th and her running aground on the shoals on January 31st be reconstructed? He read every lighthouse and lightship log from stations in the area. He interviewed every witness he could find. He corresponded with the captains of other vessels that had been in the vicinity. One of the more poignant aspects of the investigation was the role played by Captain Wormel's daughter, Lula Wormel, who took it upon herself to personally visit the family of every missing crew member in connection with a piece of purported evidence that had emerged in April 1921, a handwritten note found inside a bottle washed ashore on Buxton Beach, apparently written by a crew member, which we will examine fully in the next chapter. Lula went household to household, showing the note to wives and mothers and sisters of the missing sailors, asking if anyone recognized the handwriting. She was determined to find answers about her father. She traveled to multiple households and ultimately was not able to confirm the handwriting identification despite her efforts. Her persistence in the face of official investigation that was moving slowly and producing little was itself a kind of tribute to the 11 men who had sailed away and never returned. In the course of this work, investigators also became aware of several other vessels that had vanished in roughly the same area and time period. The SS Hewitt, an American sulfur freighter whose last known radio communication had been on January 25, 1921, in which had disappeared while carrying a cargo and crew of around 42 men from Sabine, Texas, toward Portland, Maine. The Hewitt was last seen approximately 250 miles north of Jupiter Inlet, Florida. She simply ceased to exist. No wreckage, no bodies, no radio calls. A British insurance company suggested that the two ships might have collided, but inspections of the Deering's hull show no evidence of a collision. There were also reports of other vessels lost in the same general region and time frame. Italian ships, Norwegian ships, Danish ships. The Italian inquiry into the disappearance of the vessel Monte San Michele proved particularly important because it confirmed what the American Weather Bureau was already arguing, that a series of exceptionally powerful hurricanes had been raging in the Atlantic Ocean during late January and early February 1921. Most of the missing ships had been sailing directly into those storms, and their disappearances, while tragic, were not mysterious. They had been sunk by weather. But here was the crucial point, the detail that kept the Deering's case stubbornly alive as a mystery even after the other disappearances were explained away. The Carroll A. Deering and the SS Hewitt had both been sailing away from the storms. Their courses had taken them in a direction that kept the hurricanes to their east. The weather explanation that resolved most of the other disappearances simply did not apply to these two vessels, and so the investigation narrowed. By the late summer and fall of 1921, with most of the other missing ships accounted for by the hurricane evidence, the Deering stood alone as an unexplained event. This isolation of the mystery was actually clarifying in a grim way. It meant that whatever happened to the Deering was specific to the Deering, not the result of some broad maritime catastrophe, but of something that had happened to this particular ship, with this particular crew, and on this particular voyage. The investigation was formally closed in late 1922, without an official finding. No one was ever charged with anything. The official explanation was never offered. The case went into the files, unresolved. Part 6. The Bottle. In April 1921, while the investigation was still in its early stages, and the country was hungry for any piece of solid evidence about what had happened to the Deering's crew, a local fisherman from Buxton, North Carolina, named Christopher Columbus Gray, came forward with what appeared to be a breakthrough. Gray claimed that on April 11, 1921, he had found a bottle floating in the surf off Buxton Beach. Inside the bottle was a message, handwritten on a scrap of paper. He turned it over to the authorities immediately. The message read, "Deering captured by oil-burning boat something like chaser, taking off everything, handcuffing crew hiding all over ship, no chance to make escape. Finder please notify headquarters Deering." This message was electrifying. It seemed to confirm definitively that the crew of the Carroll A. Deering had been captured by a hostile vessel. The scenario the note described was specific and plausible. A motorized chaser, a naval or paramilitary vessel powered by an internal combustion engine that burned oil rather than coal, had pulled alongside or overtaken the Deering, boarded her, handcuffed the crew, and was in the process of removing everything of value when the message was written and thrown overboard. The crew member writing it had to hide to compose the note and had no chance to escape. When the note reached Captain Warmel's widow, one of the most determined advocates for pursuing the investigation, she examined the handwriting and announced that she recognized it as that of Herbert Bates, the ship's engineer. Bates was the one crew member Wormel had spoken of with something like trust during his time in Rio de Janeiro. The widow's identification seemed to carry weight. The bottle, moreover, was determined to have been manufactured in Brazil, which was consistent with the Deering having passed through Brazilian water on her voyage. Investigators were cautiously hopeful. The note pointed toward piracy. It aligned with the strange behavior of the unidentified steamer that Jacobson at Cape Lookout had seen pass his lightship with its name hidden. It gave the investigation a new direction. But almost immediately, questions surfaced. One was practical. If a crew member had time to find paper, find a pen, write a note, find a bottle, seal it, and throw it overboard, all while supposedly being handcuffed and guarded by hostile captors, why would his note ask that the Deering Company be notified, rather than the Coast Guard or the police? Why ask for the owners to be alerted, rather than anyone with the authority and means to actually rescue them? And then, in the late summer of 1921, the bottle and the note were subjected to analysis by expert handwriting analysts from the United States Treasury Department and a second expert from another federal agency. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The note was a forgery. The handwriting was not Herbert Bates. It had been written by someone imitating a style, not producing their natural hand. Lawrence Ritchie, Hoover's investigator, traveled personally to Buxton to confront Christopher Columbus Gray. It was, by one account, a quiet and rather melancholy confrontation. Gray had told investigators that he'd found the bottle while doing routine work along the beach. Ritchie sat him down and produced the expert reports. Faced with this, Gray admitted the truth. He had written the note himself. He had placed it in the bottle, then found it, hoping that the notoriety of discovering such an important piece of evidence would give him leverage in his effort to secure employment at the Cape Hatteras lighthouse station. He had been trying to get a job there, apparently, and believed that being the man who cracked the ghost ship mystery might help his application. It was, in its way, a very human story. A struggling working man, desperate and misguided bid for recognition, a lie that briefly seemed like it might explain one of the most famous maritime mysteries of the decade. The forgery was exposed, and Gray is mostly a footnote now. His audacity remembered in passing, his full name the kind of detail that gets a small wry smile. But the Deering's note's exposure as a fraud left the investigation exactly where it had been before, with no hard evidence of anything. Part 7. The Theories. 5 departments of the government, a year and a half of investigation, dozens of interviews, and a great deal of speculation produced a number of competing theories for what happened to the crew of the Carroll A. Deering. Some of these theories were official and formally investigated. Others circulated in the press and in public conversations. A few are fringe ideas that have nonetheless attracted serious attention over the decades. Several belong, if we are being fair to history, to the category of seriously considered possibilities that cannot be dismissed simply because no evidence was ever found to confirm them. The abandonment theory. The simplest explanation for the missing crew, and the one favored by at least some of the Coast Guard officers who dealt with the vessel firsthand, is this. The ship ran aground on Diamond Shoals in foul weather. The crew recognized they were in a vessel that was taking on water and could not be saved. they abandoned ship in 2 lifeboats, hoping to row or motor to shore. Coast Guard Captain R.L. Gaskell, who was among the first to observe the Deering aground, and who was part of the team that eventually boarded her, was quite emphatic on this point. He dismissed all the dramatic theories as newspaper bunk. In his view, the situation was straightforward. The ship had grounded in conditions described as featuring 90 miles per hour winds and waves 2 to 3 stories high. The crew, faced with an impossible choice, stay with a sinking ship or take to the boats, chose the boats. And the boats in those seas were simply overwhelmed. No one survived. Captain Gaskell's position was informed by decades of experience watching ships ground on diamond shoals. He had seen this kind of disaster play out before, and the absence of bodies did not surprise him. Bodies from lifeboat disasters in those waters, in those temperatures, tended not to wash ashore in recoverable condition. This explanation has real merit. It accounts for the missing lifeboats. It explains why food was being prepared. The crew was still operating the ship normally right up until the moment she grounded, giving the cook no reason to stop. The ladder hanging over the side is consistent with climbing down into lifeboats. The 2 red distress lights burning in the rigging are consistent with the crew that had already committed to abandoning ship and was trying to signal for help before they left. And it doesn't require any villains or conspiracies, only a desperate crew, impossible conditions, and an unforgiving sea. But it struggles with several facts that don't fit neatly. The steering gear had been deliberately smashed, not damaged by impact, but taken apart with what appeared to be a sledgehammer. That damage was done by someone, and it's hard to understand why a crew, in the process of straightforwardly abandoning a grounded ship in an emergency, that would pause to smash the steering gear with a hammer. It also doesn't explain why the log and all navigational instruments were gone. Routine abandonment in a lifeboat emergency doesn't typically involve systematic removal of the ship's papers and instruments. And Captain Balance of the Cape Hatteras station offered a complicating observation to investigators. The coastline near the shoals was too rocky and jagged for lifeboats to land. In those specific conditions, on that specific stretch of coast, attempting to reach shore by lifeboat was effectively suicidal. So perhaps the crew tried and failed to reach shore. But then where are the bodies? Mutiny. Of all the theories that circulated in the wake of the Deering mystery, mutiny has always been the one with the most compelling supporting evidence. Not proof, nothing rising to the level of proof, but a coherent accumulation of suggestive facts. The relationship between Captain Wormel and First Mate McClellan was openly dysfunctional before the voyage even began, and became genuinely threatening in Barbados, where multiple credible witnesses heard McClellan threaten to get the captain. McClellan was arrested for his behavior. Wormel bailed him out, and they sailed away together. To fully appreciate how alarming this situation was by any reasonable standard, consider the structure of authority aboard a sailing vessel in 1921. A captain had essentially absolute authority over his ship. He could confine crew members, alter course, refuse to enter port, make decisions affecting life and death, all without any oversight from any authority except the ship's owners and ultimately maritime law. The captain was, for practical purposes, the sovereign of the ship. First mates operated under the captain's authority, and while friction between officers was not uncommon, a first mate who publicly threatened the captain's life in front of witnesses in a bar in a foreign port was committing something close to a declaration of war against the entire chain of command that kept the ship functioning. Wormel's decision to bail McClellan out of jail, forgive him, and sail with him again is one of the most psychologically interesting moments in the whole story. Why did he do it? We can only speculate. Perhaps Wormel was genuinely forgiving man. Perhaps he calculated that replacing McClellan in Barbados at such short notice with an unknown sailor from whatever pool of mariners happened to be in Bridgetown at the time was worse than continuing with a man he knew, even if he didn't trust him. Perhaps Wormel simply didn't take the threat as seriously as the witnesses did. Or perhaps Wormel was a 66-year-old man with failing eyesight on a ship where he knew he was not fully in control, and the prospect of open confrontation with the first mate, who had most of the crew's loyalty, was something he chose to manage through appeasement rather than authority. Whatever his reasoning, the result was that the Carroll A Deering sailed from Barbados on January 9, 1921, with a captain and a first mate who were, by documented historical record, in a relationship that had deteriorated to the point of explicit violent threat. They were on a ship with no radio equipment. They were heading into increasingly remote and dangerous waters, and they would not arrive anywhere for approximately 3 weeks. The man who hailed the Cape Lookout lightship on January 29th was not the captain, not an officer. He was, as Jacobson described, a common sailor, or at most a lower-ranking crew member. Why would Captain Wormel allow or be unable to prevent an ordinary sailor from being the ship's spokesman at an official lightship? Unless Wormel was no longer in a position to speak. The handwriting in the ship's log changes after January 23rd. Wormel's entries stopped. Someone else takes over. This is consistent with the scenario in which Wormel was incapacitated, sick, injured, imprisoned below deck, or dead after that date. The crew was milling about on the quarterdeck, as Jacobson noted. This is the behavior of men who are no longer subjected to the discipline that normally keeps sailors in their proper places on a ship. It is the behavior of men operating without effective command structure. Senator Frederick Hale of Maine, who took a close interest in the case, declared flatly that it was a plain case of mutiny. He was not alone in this view. Several investigators came informally to the same conclusion. McClellan and some or all of the crew had turned on Wormel, likely after the departure from Barbados, but before the passage of Cape Lookout. Wormel and possibly other loyal crew members, including perhaps the trusted engineer Bates, had been killed or subdued. And the mutineers, realizing they couldn't simply sail into a North Carolina or Virginia port on a ship whose crew was dead or missing, had deliberately steered the Deering onto the shoals to wreck her, then taken the lifeboats and scattered. One supporting detail that gets less attention than it deserves is that the ship's anchors were missing. The crew member who hailed Jacobson at Cape Lookout stated the ship had lost its anchors in a storm off Cape Fear. Losing both anchors simultaneously in a storm is unusual but not impossible. However, it is also possible that the anchors were not lost to a storm at all, that the explanation offered to the lightship was a cover story, and that the anchors were actually cut or dropped deliberately to prevent the ship from being able to hold position or be stopped. A ship without anchors is a ship that cannot be easily forced to stay put. and if a mutinous crew was planning to ground the Deering and flee, they might have found it useful to have the anchors gone before the ship reached the dangerous waters of the shoals. But here is the problem. If mutineers deliberately wrecked the ship, where did they go? A lifeboat full of sailors from a wrecked schooner would eventually turn up somewhere. None of them were ever found. None of the Deering's crew, murderous mutineers included, were ever seen again under their own names or any other. Unless, of course, the deliberately wrecked ship and the lifeboats entered the equation simultaneously, with a storm severe enough to kill them all. Mutiny followed by accidental death in the attempt to escape is a scenario that accounts for the strange evidence aboard the ship and the absence of any survivors. A group of mutinous sailors having gotten rid of the captain, having taken what they wanted from the ship, and disabled its steering to prevent pursuit or identification, clambering into lifeboats in late January seas off Cape Hatteras. Those are not favorable survivable conditions. The sea at that latitude in that season is cold enough to cause incapacitation within minutes of immersion. The waves were reported to be 2 or 3 stories high. A small wooden lifeboat in those conditions is not a refuge. It is a gamble. Piracy. The idea that the Carroll A Deering was taken by pirates seems almost impossibly romantic, more suited to the previous century than the 1920s. But the investigators who took it seriously were not naive romantics. They were responding to real evidence of a pattern and to a genuine historical reality. Maritime piracy had never entirely ceased in the waters of the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean. Multiple ships had disappeared in the same area around the same time. The mysterious steamer, with its name hidden, have refused to respond to the lightship at Cape Lookout. Captain O.W. Parker of the United States Marine Shipping Board argued publicly that piracy without a doubt still exists, as it has since the days of the Phoenicians, and there were documented cases of maritime crime in Caribbean and Atlantic waters during this period. The image most people carry of pirates is anchored in the golden age of piracy, the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the era of Blackbeard, the legendary captain who met his end in the waters off the North Carolina coast near Ocracoke Island in 1718, not far from Diamond Shoals, where the Deering would come to rest 2 centuries later. That earlier era of large-scale organized piracy had ended, suppressed by naval force. But opportunistic maritime crime in smaller, motorized vessels had never disappeared. By 1921, the form that maritime crime most often took in these waters was something more prosaic: fast motorboats, isolated targets, stolen cargo. The piracy theory imagines a scenario in which a motorized vessel, an oil-burning boat something like a chaser, to borrow the language of the forged note, pulled alongside or overtook the Deering somewhere between Cape Lookout and Diamond Shoals, boarded her, removed the crew by force, stripped the ship of everything valuable, and left. The mysterious steamer that passed Cape Lookout with its name hidden, which failed to respond to the lightship's signals, slots naturally into this scenario as the attacking vessel. It was following the Deering. It did not want to be identified. It was in the right place at the right time. What then happened to the crew in this scenario? Piracy in the early 20th century, when it occurred, was not typically the swashbuckling prisoner-taking variety of the Caribbean's golden age. Witnesses were liabilities. If a crew of pirates, for whatever reason, had taken the Deering's 11 men aboard their own vessel, the most practical resolution of that situation, from the pirates' perspective, was not to keep 11 witnesses alive. The absence of bodies in this scenario is not mysterious. It is the expected outcome of a crime in which disposal at sea was the logical conclusion. Wormouth's widow was, by all accounts, the most committed advocate for the piracy theory. She believed that her husband had been murdered at sea, and that whoever did it had taken pains to leave no evidence. She pressed this case with the government for months, appearing in Washington, writing letters, demanding that the investigation continue when it seemed to be losing momentum. Her certainty about piracy was, in part, the certainty of grief. It was easier to believe her husband had been taken by murderous strangers than to believe he had been killed by the very men under his command. The problem with piracy, as investigators note, is motive. What would pirates steal from the Carroll A. Deering that would justify the risk and complexity of the operation? She was sailing in ballast. Her navigational instruments had some value, but not enough to explain the effort. Her hold was empty of cargo. Investigators struggled to construct a rational economic motive for a pirate attack on a light-running schooner heading for a Virginia port with nothing to sell and cargo to steal. Unless, of course, the pirates were not primarily interested in the cargo but the ship itself, planning to refit her for their own use or to sell her to third parties. This version of the theory was discussed but never developed into anything with real evidentiary support. The rum-runner theory. The Carroll A. Deering disappeared in January 1921, almost exactly 1 year after the 18th Amendment, prohibition, had gone into effect in the United States. The illicit liquor trade, which would consume enormous criminal and organizational energy for the next 13 years, was already well underway. Rum-running operations based in the Bahamas, Cuba, and other Caribbean locations were making regular runs to the American coast, using fast boats and a network of Confederates to move whiskey and rum past the Coast Guard. There were two distinct versions of how rum-running might relate to the Deering case. The first suggested that the Deering was seized by rum-runners who wanted to use her as a transport vessel. She had, as Richard Weiner noted in his book, Ghost Ships, a cargo hold large enough to carry approximately $1 million worth of liquor in current prohibition prices. That was an enormous sum in 1921. The idea was that a rum-running gang had boarded the ship, disposed of the crew, and planned to use the vessel for a major smuggling operation before it could be identified and intercepted. The counter-argument to this is powerful. The Carroll A. Deering was a five-masted wooden schooner, 255 feet long, immediately recognizable to any experienced maritime observer. She was slow, sailing speed, not engine-powered. As a rum-running vessel, she would have been essentially useless. The entire business model of rum-running in the Prohibition era depended on speed and inconspicuousness. A five-masted schooner that everyone along the East Coast knew by sight and that could be outrun by almost any motorized vessel was precisely the wrong kind of ship for the job. The second version of the rum-runner theory centers on the mysterious, unnamed steamer that passed Cape Lookout shortly after the Deering. Recall that Captain Jacobson tried to hail the steamer with his fog signal, a signal audible at 5 miles, and the steamer did not respond. Its crew had covered the ship's nameplate with a canvas. Theories have circulated for a century that this vessel was a rum runner, operating out of the Bahamas or some other Caribbean port, making a delivery run along the Carolina coast. A rum runner would have excellent reasons for not identifying itself to a lightship keeper. It would have equally good reasons for not stopping to be questioned. Whether this steamer simply passed the Deering without incident, or whether it had some darker interaction with the schooner in the hours before she grounded on the shoals, is a question that has never been answered. No one ever identified the steamer. No one ever came forward to say they had seen anything. No evidence has ever emerged to support either version of the rum-running theory, but the unnamed steamer remains one of the most genuinely tantalizing, unanswered question in the whole case. A vessel in the right place at the right time, actively concealing its identity, that sailed into history and was never accounted for. The Bolshevik conspiracy. 1921 was the tail end of the first Red Scare in American political culture, the period of intense fear and hostility toward communist organizations that had followed the Russian Revolution of 1917 and been dramatically inflamed by a series of anarchist bombings in 1919 and 1920. The bombing of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's home in June 1919, and the famous Wall Street bombing of September 1920 that killed 38 people, had created a climate in which communist conspiracy was plausible as an explanation for almost any act of violence or disruption. The Palmer raids, in which the Department of Justice arrested thousands of suspected radicals in a series of sweeps, had taken place in January and November of 1920, barely a year before the Deering ran aground. The culture of anti-communist paranoia was at a high tide, and official Washington was primed to see Bolshevik hands in events that might otherwise look like maritime accidents. Into this atmosphere came a genuinely suggestive piece of evidence. During a police raid on the headquarters of the United Russian Workers' Party, a communist organization, in New York City, officers reportedly found documents calling on members to seize American ships and sail them to the Soviet Union. This document was not a fantasy. There had been real shipboard labor unrest in 1920, including strikes by crews on American vessels, and the idea of organized communist agitations among maritime workers was not entirely implausible. The documents were connected, at least circumstantially, to several of these labor actions. There was also a specific anecdote involving Wormel himself. According to some accounts, while the captain was in Brazil, he had an encounter with a man who identified himself as a Bolshevik and threatened that his kind would get Wormel before long. If true, this was a remarkably specific and personal threat, made in a foreign port, to the captain of a vessel that would shortly disappear. Investigators took it seriously enough to include it in their reports, though the sourcing for this story is murky. It comes through second-hand accounts and its reliability is genuinely uncertain. The scenario of the Bolshevik theory was consistent with the wider Red Scare fears. Communist agents, possibly having infiltrated the crew of the Deering or working from a mysterious unnamed steamer, had seized the ship as part of a coordinated plan to deliver American vessels to Soviet ports, demonstrating communist reach and power in depriving the United States of maritime assets. The Soviet Union was less than 4 years old. Its intentions were deeply uncertain. The prospect of organized communist maritime piracy operating in American coastal waters felt to people steep in the anxieties of the Red Scare, like exactly the kind of audacious provocation the new Soviet state might be willing to attempt. But the theory has always had a fundamental evidentiary problem. No evidence has ever surfaced that any of the alleged ship-seizing activities described in the United Russian Workers' Party documents were ever actually carried out. Not once, anywhere, in any documented case. The documents existed and they described a plan, but there is no evidence that the plan was executed even once, let alone in the specific case of the Carroll A. Deering. The theory, while compelling as a 1921 political atmosphere, remains exactly that. The secret cargo theory. This theory is less often discussed than some of the others, but it is important because it touches on a detail of the voyage that investigators never fully explained. What exactly did the Deering do in Barbados, and is it possible that the stop involved something more than taking on routine supplies? The Barbados stop in January 1921 occurred during a period of a significant informal commerce in the Caribbean related to prohibition. Barbados was a British territory not subject to American alcohol laws, and its ports were, like many Caribbean ports in this era, places where the boundaries between legitimate trade and contraband were porous and frequently crossed. The possibility floated by some investigators was that the Deering's crew, while in Barbados, had agreed to carry a secret cargo, like liquor, north to some point along the American coast, where it would be delivered to rum runners or directly to bootleggers. Under this scenario, the ship made a rendezvous somewhere between Barbados and Cape Lookout. The delivery was made, and then something went wrong. A dispute over payment, a decision to silence witnesses, or simply the brutal logic of criminals who had allowed 11 sailors to see too much. The crew was taken off the ship, killed, and disposed of at sea. The ship was left adrift, or was deliberately steered towards the shoal. This theory has the virtue of explaining the unknown steamer. It has the virtue of explaining the departure from Barbados with certain suspicious behavior already in evidence. The strange crew behavior, the unexplained absence of the anchors, and it would explain why the investigation, despite all its efforts, never found the crew. Because the crew had been killed by people who were very good at making evidence disappear, and who had every incentive to ensure they were never identified. But it rests on speculation rather than evidence. No proof has ever emerged that the Deering carried any illicit cargo. No witness has ever come forward to describe such a rendezvous. And the theory requires us to postulate a criminal operation sophisticated enough to execute a perfect crime on the open ocean while leaving the ship in a condition that produced years of public and governmental inquiry. The insurance fraud theory. Another fringe possibility that was discussed, if never formally investigated with the same vigor as the other theories, was the possibility of maritime insurance fraud. The ship was insured. A ship's loss at sea under the right circumstances, declared an accident, could be worth a significant sum to the owners and potentially to others with financial interest in the vessel. The deliberate wrecking of a ship for insurance purposes was not unheard of in the maritime world of the early 20th century. It was, in fact, a crime with a long enough history that insurers had developed specific contractual clauses to address it. Under this scenario, someone with a financial motive arranged for the Carroll A. Deering to be grounded on diamond shoals, with the crew either complicit and dispersed afterward or disposed of to prevent testimony. The smashed steering gear, the removed log and instruments, the methodical clearing of personal effects, these could all be consistent with deliberately staged loss rather than a genuine accident. The theory was undermined by several practical considerations. The Deering was not a particularly valuable vessel by 1921 standards. She was one of the last of a dying class of wooden schooners, and her insurance value, while meaningful, was not the kind of sum that typically motivated elaborate maritime fraud. More fundamentally, the crew of 11 men represented a significant logistical complication for any fraud scheme. Getting rid of or silencing 11 sailors is far more complex than simply running a ship aground. And the Deering Company, which owned the ship and would have been the primary beneficiary of any fraud, showed no sign in the investigation that they were anything other than genuinely distressed and cooperative. The insurance fraud theory was never seriously pursued, but it is part of the full landscape of what investigators considered. The illness or food poisoning theory. One possibility that surfaces occasionally, but rarely gets extended discussion, is the idea that something happened to the crew's health, a sudden outbreak of illness or food poisoning serious enough to have incapacitated or killed crew members before the ship ever ran aground. Ergotism, a condition caused by eating bread or grain contaminated with ergot fungus, which was responsible for episodes of mass hysteria in historical populations, can produce symptoms including hallucinations, convulsions, and vascular constriction. In its severe form, it can be rapidly fatal. Some researchers have suggested that ergotism might explain the behavior of the crew at Cape Lookout, the milling on the quarterdeck, the failure to behave in normal officer-directed way, a possible departure from rational behavior. The problem with this theory is that ergotism, while genuinely terrifying, does not explain why the steering gear was smashed or why the ship's log and all navigational instruments were systematically removed. Sick or dying people do not take time to destroy the compass housing and carry the chronometer away before collapsing. The physical evidence on the ship points too strongly toward deliberate organized human action for a purely medical explanation to fit. Food poisoning of a more conventional kind, contaminated provisions taken on in Barbados, is similarly limited as an explanation for the same reason. A crew made sick by bad food might abandon ship in a disorganized panic. They would not first smash the binnacles with a sledgehammer. The waterspout theory. One theory that surfaces periodically in popular treatments of the Deering is the possibility that a waterspout, a rotating column of water-laden air, essentially a tornado over the sea, struck the ship and swept every person on deck overboard in a matter of seconds, leaving the vessel otherwise intact and drifting. Waterspouts are genuine phenomena and genuine hazards. They can form rapidly, move erratically, and strike with little warning. They are more common in warm water tropical and subtropical regions, but they do occur in the North Atlantic, including off the Carolina coast. A waterspout of sufficient intensity could take human beings off a ship's deck before they had time to react. This theory appeals to people because it requires no human malice and explains the suddenness of the crew's disappearance. If a waterspout struck during a night's watch, when only 2 or 3 crew members were on deck and the rest were below. It would explain why there was food being prepared for the following day and why no distress signal was sent before the distress lights were lit, because there was no time. But the theory breaks down against the physical evidence almost immediately. Waterspouts, like tornadoes, leave damage behind. They tear sails, snap spars, scatter objects, create visible disorder. The Carroll A Deering's sails were found intact. Her rigging was found intact. Nothing on deck showed the kind of violent physical disturbance that a powerful waterspout would have created. And a waterspout does not smash the binnacle box, does not remove the ship's log and navigational instruments, and does not place a sledgehammer near the ruined steering gear. January is also not peak waterspout season off Cape Hatteras, and no other vessels in the area reported seeing one during the relevant period. The theory is not impossible, taken in isolation, but the deliberate damage aboard the ship makes it essentially untenable as a standalone explanation. Something intentional happened on the Carroll A Deering. The waterspout theory has no mechanism for intentionality. The Hewitt connection. One of the more poignant theories, and the one that most directly addresses the absence of bodies or survivors, concerns the SS Hewitt, the sulfur freighter that disappeared around the same time and in the same general area. The SS Hewitt was a steel-hulled bulk freighter, 387 feet long, carrying a full cargo of sulfur from Sabine, Texas to Portland, Maine, with a stop in Boston. Under the command of Captain Hans Jacob Hansen, she had made her regular radio calls on January 24th and January 25th, reported nothing unusual, and was last seen approximately 250 nautical miles north of Jupiter Inlet, Florida. She was expected in Boston on January 29th. She never arrived. No radio signals were received after January 25th. No wreckage was found. No bodies were recovered. 42 men simply ceased to exist aboard a large steel-hulled freighter in ordinary sea conditions with no distress calls. The disappearance of the Hewitt just days before the Deering was found aground created an immediate investigative question. Were the two events connected? The State Department, in its confidential circular of June 17, 1921, was careful. There is nothing to connect the two casualties, except the similarity of date and place of occurrence. The most compelling version of the Hewitt connection runs as follows. The Deering's crew, having abandoned ship in the two lifeboats, was spotted by the Hewitt, which, as maritime law and tradition required, turned toward the distress signal and took the men aboard. The Hewitt then continued on its course northward, carrying both its own crew and the 11 survivors from the Deering, and then, somewhere between the Carolina coast and Boston, the Hewitt was lost in the severe Atlantic storms of early February 1921, or for some other reason. The explosion and flash reportedly seen off the New Jersey coast by a reporter named Aycock Brown, documented in a 1952 article, was proposed as possibly the Hewitt's end. This theory has a certain elegance and considerable emotional pull. It requires no murderers and no conspiracies. It reduces the mystery to a chain of maritime misfortunes: a grounding, a rescue, a storm, a sinking. 53 people, all lost together, the Hewitt carrying its terrible double cargo to the bottom. But the deliberate damage to the steering gear keeps reasserting itself. The Hewitt rescue scenario works best if the crew abandoned ship in a straightforward emergency. It works very badly if the crew first smashed the steering equipment and systematically removed the log and all instruments before leaving. Why do that if you are about to be rescued by a passing steamship? Why erase all evidence of the ship's recent management if the outcome is simply that 53 people will drown together in a February storm? The obstacle the theory cannot clear is the sledgehammer. The Bermuda Triangle. The Carroll A Deering is regularly cited in discussions of the Bermuda Triangle, the region of the North Atlantic bounded roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, within which an unusually large number of ships and aircraft have supposedly disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The mythology of the Bermuda Triangle was largely a creation of the late 1960s and 1970s, appearing in books like Charles Burlett's 1974 bestseller, The Bermuda Triangle. But the Deering case had been cited as an early instance of triangle strangeness by writers like Vincent Gaddis, who coined the phrase Bermuda Triangle in a 1964 article in Argosy magazine, and Charles Fort, who wrote about inexplicable maritime disappearances as early as 1931. The connection between the Deering and the Triangle rests primarily on geography. The ship's route from Barbados northward toward Cape Hatteras did pass through the general region of the western North Atlantic that triangle enthusiasts designate as their zone of interest. The ship also passed through waters not far from where the USS Cyclops, the Navy collier that vanished in 1918 with 306 men aboard, had sailed on nearly identical route, departure from Brazil, stopover in Barbados, northward along the American coast. The USS Cyclops disappearing without a trace and without a distress call became one of the cornerstone cases of Bermuda Triangle mythology, and the Deering similarity of route made it a natural companion piece. However, there are some fundamental issues with this connection. The Diamond Shoals, where the Deering ran aground and where her crew presumably departed, are not within the traditional boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle. The triangle's most commonly drawn boundaries place its northernmost point around Bermuda, well offshore and well east of Cape Hatteras. Cape Hatteras itself and the Outer Banks are firmly on the American continental shelf, connected to the mainland and separated from any reasonable Bermuda Triangle boundary by hundreds of miles of ocean. The Deering came aground in American coastal waters, not in the open Atlantic void that triangle mythology invokes. More substantively, the serious debunking of Bermuda Triangle mythology, most effectively done by Larry Cush in his 1975 book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, demonstrated that most of the disappearances attributed to the triangle either didn't occur as described, involve perfectly ordinary explanations that the popular accounts simply omitted, or took place well outside the triangle's boundaries. Cush's method was to go back to the primary sources: ship records, Coast Guard reports, weather data, news accounts from the time of the incidents, and compare them with the versions that have been retold in triangle literature. The discrepancies were systematic and revealing. Many triangle disappearances occurred during known storms. Many happened far from the triangle's boundaries. Some didn't happen at all. The Deering falls into Cush's third category, outside the boundaries, and also to a degree into the first. The weather in the region during late January and early February 1921 was genuinely severe, with major Atlantic hurricanes confirmed by multiple national weather services. The triangle theory doesn't explain any of the specifics, concrete evidence found aboard the ship. It doesn't account for McClellan's threat, the changed handwriting, the milling crew, or the smashed steering gear. It offers no mechanism. What force would a supernatural or anomalous triangle zone exert that would cause a ship's first mate to smash the compass housing with a sledgehammer? The triangle explanation is, at bottom, a genre of storytelling that substitutes atmosphere for causation. It gestures towards the inexplicable without actually explaining anything. This doesn't mean that the Deering's fate is entirely explicable in conventional terms. The genuine mystery remains. It just means that the Bermuda Triangle, as an explanatory framework, adds nothing to the inquiry and resolves nothing. The real story, whatever it was human. It happened between men on a ship in a specific window of time. Part 8. The Weight of Evidence. A century of analysis has produced no definitive answer to the mystery of the Carroll A Deering, but it has produced a clearer sense of which explanations are more or less compatible with the available evidence. If we consider the full picture, the threat in Barbados, the strange behavior at Cape Lookout, the changed handwriting in the log, the smashed steering gear, the orderly removal of all personal effects and navigational instruments, the missing lifeboats, certain things begin to feel more likely than others. There is also the question of timing. The handwriting in the log changes after January 23, 1921. The Cape Lookout sighting takes place on January 29th. The grounding occurs on January 31st. Whatever happened aboard the Deering happened in that window of roughly 6 days. The last clear evidence of Captain Wormel's authority is January 23rd. By January 29th, someone else is speaking for the ship and the crew is milling unsupervised on the quarterdeck. Somewhere in those 6 days, the normal order of things aboard the Carroll A Deering came apart. January 23rd is itself interesting. It is not a date that corresponds to any particular navigational event or weather incidents that investigators were able to identify. The Deering was, on January 23rd, somewhere in the Atlantic north of Barbados, making her way up the coast toward Cape Lookout and the Outer Banks. She was at sea, out of sight of land, unreachable by any outside authority. Whatever happened, happened in that isolation. The smashed steering gear is, in many ways, the most significant piece of evidence, and it is consistently underweighted in popular treatments of the mystery. Waves don't smash steering gear. Grounding doesn't smash steering gear. A sledgehammer smashes steering gear. Someone did that deliberately, and they did it with what appears to be the specific intent of ensuring that the ship could not be maneuvered or controlled. Why would someone do that? There are really only a few possible reasons. One is that they wanted the ship to ground, that they intended the Deering to run onto the shoals and smash the gear to ensure she couldn't be steered away from them. This is consistent with a deliberate wrecking, which could be the endgame of either a mutiny, get rid of the ship and any evidence aboard it, or piracy or hijacking scenario, disable the ship so it can't follow or be used against you. Another possibility is that the steering gear was smashed in a rage or moment of violence, that it was a part of a confrontation aboard the ship rather than a strategic decision. But this seems less likely, given that everything else about the Deering's apparent abandonment appears relatively orderly. The changed handwriting after January 23rd suggests that whoever was keeping the log after that date was not Wormel. This could mean Wormel was ill, but it is more consistent with Wormel being unable to keep the log for a less benign reason: dead, confined, or otherwise incapacitated. The man at Cape Lookout, who was clearly not an officer, hailing the lightship and reporting lost anchors, is consistent with the crew that was operating without normal command structure. Whether this is because the officers were dead, imprisoned, or simply replaced by a mutinous crew who had appointed their own spokesman, the effect is the same. By January 29, 1921, at the latest, normal authority aboard the Carroll A. Deering had broken down. The absence of all personal effects is interesting. In a true emergency abandonment, you don't have time to systematically collect everyone's clothing, money, documents, and keepsakes. But in a deliberate departure, you do. The removal of all personal effects suggests that whoever left the ship had time to do so in an organized way. This is more consistent with a planned departure than with a sudden disaster. If we put this together, the picture that emerges most clearly is something like this. At some point after January 23rd and before January 29th, 1921, authority aboard the Carroll A. Deering broke down. The captain was no longer in command. There may have been violence. The crew, or a significant portion of the crew, was operating under a different authority structure than the one it had sailed with. On or around January 29th, approaching the dangerous waters of the Outer Banks without the anchors that would be needed to hold the ship off the shores, the decision was made, or accepted as inevitable, that the Deering would ground. The steering gear was disabled. Everything of value, personal effects, instruments, documents, was removed to the lifeboats. The ship was left to run into the shoals. And then the people in the lifeboats, whoever they were, disappeared as thoroughly as anything else. The sea is very large. The January Atlantic off Cape Hatteras is very cold and very rough. Lifeboats from a 19th century commercial schooner are not designed for extended open water survival in those conditions. If the lifeboats capsized, which in 90 mile per hour winds and 12-foot waves was entirely plausible, the occupants would have died within minutes in water cold enough to cause incapacitation almost immediately. They would have left almost no trace. This is arguably the most complete explanation the evidence supports. Not a single clean answer, but a sequence of human events, followed by the indifferent violence of the sea doing what it always does. Part 9. The Aftermath. The Carroll A. Deering was destroyed by dynamite on March 4, 1921, roughly a month after she ran aground. A portion of her bow drifted south and came to rest on Ocracoke Island, where it lay for decades. In September 1955, Hurricane Ione moved the remaining hull approximately 9 miles, carrying it from Ocracoke Island to Hatteras. Even in her posthumous existence, she couldn't quite stop moving. The investigation formally closed in late 1922 without a finding. The case went into government archives. The newspapers moved on. But the story never really went away. Charles Fort, the great American chronicler of the inexplicable, mentioned the Carroll A. Deering in his 1931 book, Lo, alongside the Mary Celeste and other ghost ship mysteries. Ford was a writer who made a career of collecting accounts of events that didn't fit the scientific or governmental consensus, and he found in the Deering exactly the kind of story he loved, specific enough to be verifiable, inexplicable enough to resist tidy resolution, and populated by real named human beings whose fate remained a genuine question. The ship became one of his canonical examples, appearing in lists alongside the USS Cyclops. Vincent Gaddis wrote about the Deering in his 1965 book, Invisible Horizon, True Mysteries of the Sea, the same book in which he coined the phrase Bermuda Triangle, introducing the case to the triangle mythology that would define its popular cultural life for the next decade. Charles Berlitz included it in his 1974 bestseller, The Bermuda Triangle, connecting it to the triangle at the height of that mythology's popular moment. Larry Kush addressed it in his 1975 debunking work, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, arguing that the triangle explanation was unnecessary given the straightforward mutiny evidence. Richard Weiner's Ghost Ship, published in 2000, devoted substantial space to the case, including the rum-runner calculation about the Deering's cargo hold value. And in 2002, the writer and musician Bland Simpson published Ghost Ship of Diamond Shoals, The Mystery of the Carroll A. Deering, the most thorough single-volume account of the case, drawing on primary sources and providing the richest available account of the human drama that preceded the disappearance. Simpson's book, published by the University of North Carolina Press, remains the definitive scholarly treatment of the subject. The case has also found its way into television. In 2013, the Travel Channel's long-running series Mysteries at the Museum, hosted by Don Wildman, which examines historical artifacts held in museums around the country, devoted an episode to the Carroll A. Deering, centering the story on the ship's bell held at the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum. The episode aired as part of Season 4, Episode 16, and introduced the mystery to a new generation of viewers who had not encountered the case through books or regional maritime history. The Mysteries at the Museum treatment is not unusual for the Deering. The story fits exactly the format that cable-era documentary television was built to tell. A physical artifact, a dramatic backstory, competing theories, no resolution. The case has also migrated into digital gaming. The mobile game Seaport, a seafaring simulation and collection game, included the Carroll A. Deering as a featured vessel during a special Bermuda Triangle in-game event in 2019. The ship's appearance in a mobile game marketed to a general audience, selected for its ghostly association with the triangle, illustrates how thoroughly the Deering's identity had become entangled with paranormal maritime mythology in popular culture, regardless of what the historical evidence actually suggests. The podcast era has been particularly generous to the Deering story, beginning in the mid-2010s and accelerating into the 2020s. The proliferation of true crime and mystery podcasts created a natural home for the case. The Futility Closet podcast covered it in episode 199 in May 2018, drawing on Simpson and Snow as primary sources and reaching a large audience of people drawn to historical oddities. The State Archives of North Carolina's documentary podcast, Connecting the Dots, devoted a two-part series to the case in 2019, working directly from the archival materials held in the state's collection. A notably rigorous treatment compared to most podcast coverage. The Carolina Haynes podcast covered it in its 100th anniversary broadcast in December 2020. The Thinking Sideways podcast addressed it in 2016. The case recurs with striking regularities across the podcast landscape, appearing in shows dedicated to true crime, maritime history, unsolved mysteries, the paranormal, and regional folklore, each new platform finding a new audience for a story that at its core has not changed and has not been solved since January 1921. There is something worth noting about the way Carroll A. Deering moves through popular culture. It is almost always presented as a Bermuda Triangle story, or a ghost ship story, or a paranormal mystery, even though the historical evidence points more toward human conflict and maritime misfortune than toward anything supernatural. The vessel's pop culture identity has, over the decades, drifted somewhat away from the specific, grounded human story that the primary sources tell. A 66-year-old captain with failing eyes, a first mate who made a threat in a bar and was forgiven, a ship sailing into danger in late January. The real story is in many ways more interesting than the ghost ship mythology that has accumulated around it, but the mythology is part of the story now, in the way that legends always become part of the things they describe. The ship's bell and capstan found their way to the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras Village, which opened in 2002 and substantially reopened after renovations in 2024. If you visit Hatteras Island today, you can see these artifacts and stand on the beach and look out at the water in the direction of the Diamond Shoals. And think about what happened out there. The shoals themselves are invisible, of course, submerged, changeable, silent, but the lighthouse still stands. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States, still sends its beams out across the same water that has been consuming ships since 1526. The light that the crew of the Carroll A Deering never quite managed to steer toward. The man whose name was on the ship, Carroll Atwood Deering, bookkeeper, youngest son of the Gardner G. Deering Company's founder, lived for another 46 years after the ship's loss, dying in March 1967 at the age of 84. He reportedly felt that the association of his name with the ghost ship was uncomfortable and unwanted. He was a quiet man who worked with numbers, not the sea. The sea had not asked his permission to make him famous. In the years that followed the investigation's closure, there were scattered possible sightings of crew members reported to the State Department through its network of consular officers. A sailor in a Portuguese port, a man in Brazil whose description loosely matched one of the Deering's crew. Each of these leads was followed up on, and each one dissolved into coincidences or misidentification. No one was ever confirmed as a survivor or a perpetrator. The Carroll A Deering vanished as completely as the crew it had carried, absorbed into the category of things that the sea took and kept. Part 10. The Silence. We have told you everything that is known about the Carroll A Deering. We have followed the ship from its construction in Bath to its grounding on Diamond Shoals. We have traced the voyage, the coal cargo, the sick captain, the last-minute substitution, the long passage to Brazil, the disdain and distrust in Rio de Janeiro, the drunken threat in Barbados, the strange final sighting at Cape Lookout, the 4 days of watching a beautiful ship battered by the waves with no one visible on her deck. We have examined every theory that serious investigators and curious minds have brought to bear on the mystery. We have looked at the evidence honestly, the smashed steering gear, the missing log, the changed handwriting, the food on the stove, the ladder over the side, the cats. And we are left, after all of it, with the same thing the original investigators were left with, a mystery. Not the comfortable kind of mystery that secretly has an answer waiting to be found. The genuine kind. The kind where answers may simply be gone, swallowed by the same ocean that swallowed the crew. This is not unusual in maritime history, actually. The sea is a very effective destroyer of evidence. It is cold and corrosive and fast. Wooden lifeboats don't last long in open water. Human bodies in the North Atlantic decompose quickly, and those that don't are carried by currents to depths where they will never be found. The absence of bodies, of wreckage, of any trace of the Deering's 11 men after they left the ship is not in and of itself necessarily indicative of anything sinister. The sea takes things and keeps them. What makes the Carroll A Deering genuinely compelling, what keeps it alive as a mystery, what keeps people thinking about it 100 years later, is not just the absence of an explanation, but the presence of so many suggestive clues that don't quite resolve into a complete picture. The threat in Barbados, the changed handwriting, the crew on the quarterdeck where they weren't supposed to be, the man with the reddish hair who wasn't an officer, the smashed steering gear. All of these point in the same general direction toward human conflict and breakdown, but none of them quite answers the mystery. We can see the shape of a story that we cannot quite read. There is something almost literary about this. In the most precise sense of that word, the Carroll A. Deering mystery has the structure of a story that has lost its ending. All the setup is there, the foreshadowing is meticulous, the characters are distinct and their conflicts clearly drawn, and then the narrative simply stops. We do not get to find out what happened in the final scene. The sea walked into the middle of the story and took the ending with it. And there is something fitting about this in the context of where and when it happened. The Carroll A. Deering was built at the very end of the Age of Sail, a ship that was already an anachronism at the moment of her launching, a piece of the 19th century that somehow persisted into the 20th. She sailed routes that the wooden schooners had been sailing for 200 years, carrying coal that the world was already beginning to replace with oil and electricity. She flew canvas sails over waters that were increasingly dominated by steel hull steamships and the beginnings of motorized traffic. The men who sailed her were the last generation of sailors in the tradition that had built the American merchant marine from the ground up over 3 centuries. Most of them were not Americans. They were Danish and Scandinavian sailors who had grown up in a tradition of deep water commercial sailing and who carried their skills across the Atlantic to staff the diminishing fleet of wooden vessels that still needed such skills. In a sense, they too were anachronisms, men whose expertise was in a dying craft, sailing a dying ship through waters that had been taking ships for centuries, and that would go on taking ships long after every wooden schooner had rotted or burned, or been blown up with dynamite. And she vanished, in the end, in the way that the whole era of which she was part vanished, without ceremony, without a full accounting, leaving behind a few artifacts and a great deal of silence. The Carroll A. Deering ship's bell in Capstane sits in a museum in Hatteras Village, a few miles from the place where she ran aground. The bell is brass, tarnished green in places, ordinary looking, the kind of object you might walk past quickly in any nautical collection. But if you stand in front of it for a moment and let it register what it is and where it's been, it becomes something else. It was on that ship when it left Bath. It was there in Rio de Janeiro's harbor. It rang in Barbados. It was tolling the watches at sea in late January 1921, when somewhere in the open Atlantic, things went wrong in ways we still cannot fully account for. It was there when the ship ground into Diamond Shoals. It sat in the surf for 4 days while rescue boats tried to reach the wreck. And it is here now, in a climate control room in North Carolina, 2 miles from where the sea took everyone who ever touched it. Objects outlast people. That is one of the oldest and saddest facts of human experience. And the bell of the Carroll A. Deering is a perfect instance of it. 11 men are gone without a trace, without a body, without a final word. The ship they sailed was blown apart with dynamite. The world they moved through, the world of wooden schooners in coal cargoes and 5-masted vessels working the eastern seaboard, has been gone for a century. But the bell remains, heavy and mute and permanent in a way that human lives are not. There will be no resolution to this story. That is not a failure of research or investigation or imagination. It is simply a fact about what happened and about what the sea does with facts. The men of the Carroll A. Deering went into the Atlantic in late January 1921 in conditions that were cold and violent and indifferent to human survival, and they did not come back. Whether they went as victims of a crime, as desperate men trying to escape one, as the accidental casualties of the worst weather in years, or as some combination of all three, we do not know. The evidence is suggestive, and the silence is total, and 100 years have not closed the gap between those two things. That is the whole story. Not a resolution, but a resting place. The Carroll A. Deering sailed, and the sea kept her secret, and the bell is in a museum in Hatteras Village, and the light still turns.